Thank you so much, Udo, Musa, the entire NOMA UIUC organization. I think that this is an amazing symposium, and I'm so glad and happy to be here. So let me just set myself up here. I'm so happy and glad to be here, and I want to definitely give my flowers and respect to Professor Ele and also Professor Coles. I think that everything that they spoke about definitely resonates deeply with me on an intrinsic level, and I think that these conversations definitely need to be had. So, I think the first step is obviously having gatherings such as this to essentially really figure out what the next steps are. You know, studying from history, studying from patterns, perspectives, and elements, and essentially context as a whole. So, thank you once again. So, getting into my presentation here, this is going to be a little bit different because I wouldn't classify myself as an educator or as a professor. I don't have the credentials, but I am an architectural designer, and I do have some experience on the approach that was taken to essentially design a Pan-African aesthetic structure located in New York City. So without further ado, let's get into this more of a case study lecture. So the title of my presentation will be African American Architecture, the Reappropriation of Space Taking Shape. And okay, here we go. So how did I get here? To give you guys some self-context, I attended Howard University, as Udo said, and upon attending Howard University, which you all know is a historically Black college university, I took a course in Caribbean architecture. I am of Jamaican descent, and this is really what spearheaded my liking or my interest in understanding the built environment of individuals stemming from the Caribbean or from a different perspective. I think that growing up in New York City, I was really inundated with Eurocentric ideals and the building practicality of American or Eurocentric type of ornate details. And I think that Caribbean architecture, when you first look at it or when you grow up watching it from the perspective of television or even from social media, there's a sense that it's shabby or that there's a shanty town, but you begin to really understand that there's actually a pragmatism and there's a cultural background and a backstory to the context of why some of the buildings look the way they do and why some look like, something else. So upon leaving Howard University, I started working at urban architectural initiatives. And for the first 4 years, I worked only on rehabs all throughout New York City. And I think this really started to lend to me the pragmatic aspect of building and just constructability from the sense of how to actually see a project through from construction. So when you're in school, it's very design-esque. You figure out your creative and your cultural expression and what you really want to focus on. But I think that working on these rehabs for 4 years, I was able to actually open up literally buildings in New York City that were constructed 50, 60, 70, sometimes even 80 years prior, and see how these particular buildings were constructed. Until the project of a lifetime came my way, which was to design a Pan-African community center. And I can almost even remember the client saying that he wanted a building that really represented the embodiment of African American youth, particularly in New York City. So it left us, my firm, myself, and the individuals that were on the project with the question of what does a Pan-African community center look like? So with this particular question in mind, we understood that we had a program to design a Pan-African architectural aesthetic structure, but we understand that the context is based in New York City and it's for African American minority youth. And the lineage of a city of immigrants, specifically the context of African Americans, traces back to the Caribbean, as well as, of course, Africa, where the transatlantic slave trade occurred. So this is the program and context that we were left to deal with. And it furthered us to question what is the perspective of Blackness and identity in a mixed city as it pertains to architecture. because as you know, New York City is a city of African Americans, Jews, Asians, Caucasians, Indian Americans, and pretty much everyone else. And it left us with the idea that African Americans who are inhabiting structures in New York City are essentially inhabiting the architecture built and provided by others for African Americans. Enter Robert Moses. If you don't know who this is, Robert Moses is a pivotal figure in New York City's history. He essentially was responsible for the parkways. He was responsible for really providing the systemic backbone to building a particular infrastructure that really lent itself to individuals who would have and individuals who would have not. He really kind of created like a legal way how to actually build a city that would be to the disadvantage and to the disadvantage of Black or African American individuals and to the betterment of everyone else who was essentially of a different race. So really what he did is he ushered in the architecture of discrimination. And with this architecture of discrimination, we can see this particular image is relative to low income, impoverishment, poverty, Black, Latino, and essentially individuals or people of color living in New York City, a la the projects or New York City Housing Authority. And to understand more of what Robert Moses really did, I implore everyone to read these two books, The Color of Law and The Power Broker, to really understand how, from a municipal and from a legal perspective, infrastructure and the economic backbone of the disadvantagement of African Americans was essentially put into place by people like Robert Moses. But it was from the New York City Housing Authority that arose hip hop culture, which I'm sure you all are very familiar with. It's $1 billion industry today, but a lot of people don't realize that it stemmed from 1520 Sedgwick Avenue. As a native of the Bronx, I'm very relative and aware of this, that the project buildings are essentially where hip hop started. And this is what Robert Moses provided to individuals of color, to African Americans, immigrants coming into New York City. So as you see, we started to adapt and to use spaces differently. This is a park that was essentially designed for basketball and for pool and for tennis. But as you can see here, individuals are using the space in the way that they see fit, based upon their experiences and them wanting to culturally express themselves. So we see that not only amongst African Americans, but amongst all people, that cultural expression really plays a huge role into the built environment as well as the architecture. And I think this image really presents a tale of two cities, or the plight of a tale of two cities, as architecture essentially was used as human hierarchy. As we know, you have the building in the background, which essentially is a beacon within New York City, and it has ornate detail that really lends itself back to essentially a comparison and a relativity to individuals who are maybe migrating from Europe to be able to nestle themselves into the city and feel a sense of home. Whereas the building in the forefront is American, but at the same time, the individuals who are living there necessarily really didn't have a hand in building this particular structure. So it was something that they had to adapt to. So furthermore, we see that architecture is used as human hierarchy, where individuals in the Bronx and Brooklyn, specifically the South Bronx and Bedford-Stuyvesant and Red Hook, have little to no access to resources, little access to amenities. The architecture is Eurocentric, it's American, but it's also cheap. And the individuals living there don't have a hand in the way how it looks. So there's an inferiority complex because there's no cultural expression, there's no relativity to their background, and the individuals living more in pristine areas or areas of successful individuals are in Lower Manhattan. There's abundance of resources and amenities. There's Eurocentric, American, rich architecture, and there's a feel of superiority because an individual migrating to the city, say from anywhere in Europe, can feel a sense of, as I stated before, relativity and comparison to back home. So it's easier to nestle themselves within the city and become one with the city and grow with the city and essentially affect the city in a positive way that would benefit them. And continuing with high immigration came the financial crisis, white flight of 1950 to 1980, where individuals were leaving the city, headed to the suburbs, and poverty and impoverishment continues to rise in the city. The suburban culture becomes superior. There's mortgage discrimination because individuals of color couldn't buy homes until the Fair Housing Act was passed. And there's little resources to no resources in the city. So there's an inferiority complex psychologically that begins to take place and begins to take hold within the city. So we begin to see that the New York City Housing Authority, and just living in the city towards the 1970s, 1980s, as there's a financial crisis, as individuals of color can't get a mortgage to buy their own home in the suburban areas, specifically in New York City, that this architecture for the poor was really architecture for individuals of color. And if you've ever been to a New York City Housing Authority building in New York City, you'll understand that it's very cold. There's very little cultural expression from the foundational functional building aspect. So from this study, we were able to draw a conclusion that there's an initial transformation, and then there's a cultural interference, which is very impactful, and then there's a reappropriation, and then there's an ultimate resistance with the rise of hip hop culture and individuals using spaces differently. So you could call this the architecture of, per se, resistance. But this is not the first time the architecture of resistance actually occurred. This is only in the 20th century. As we look further back in American history, we can see that the architecture of resistance, as it pertains to African Americans, actually stems back towards the 18th century. So let's go all the way back to the study of Black dwelling, gathering, congregating, living, and being during slavery years. And what is an appropriate space for an African who is being transported from West Africa to the Americas and to the Caribbean? And what does this space look like in this particular day and age? And this is a pivotal image because I think that when you search the African mud hut, it spans back thousands of years in multiple different tribal zones throughout the entire continent of Africa. And there's four common characteristics. It's that it's vernacular, there's a use of readily available materials, it blends in with the natural landscape, and there's a textured aesthetic. And when we look towards a furthering within plantation days and slavery days, the four common characteristics hold over, where there's vernacular architecture, there's a use of readily available materials, there's a natural blend with the landscape, and there's a textured aesthetic. So this is an image with thatched roofing with readily available materials in America during slavery. But there was a transformation that took place because, as you can see, as I stated in the conclusions that I drew from a previous slide, that there was a cultural interference. See, in the 18th century, slave owners and plantation owners didn't necessarily see Africans building in a relative manner as it pertained to Africa, where they were essentially stolen from and brought to America. They didn't see this as a threat because architecturally they just saw the architecture as inferior. But as you see, as we move closer towards the 19th century, slave owners and plantation owners wanted to psychologically impose their will upon African slaves. As you see, James Cooper, owner of Hopeton Plantation in Georgia, discovered that Okra, his African slave, built an African hut plastered with mud and thatched with palmetto leaves. And upon learning this, he had the building torn down immediately. And I think that this is very significant in African American culture post this experience of the 19th century, because we begin to see that there's an inferiority complex, and individuals of African descent who were slaves here, as they started to be born into slavery, had no access to traditional African culture. And from that, cultural interference stemmed into cultural adaptation, where once slavery was starting to be, it was further on the outs during 1865, when individuals of color could buy their own land, they actually started to build in the building styles of European architectural stylage, or they started to build in the sense of just Eurocentric architecture. And I think that this is very pivotal in understanding the culture of the Deep South. So as you see here, we're going to move down to the Caribbean, where a very prominent building in a small country called Mandeville in Jamaica, they built in a Georgian style, but it's called the Jamaican Georgian style. So even though long after slavery, individuals have the autonomy, they have the resource to build whatever kind of home that they would want to build. And for this particular courthouse, which is still operative to this day, I believe, they built this particular home. So it lends itself back to the idea that there was inferiority complex, and it marries the elegance of Georgian styling with functional features designed to weather Jamaica's tropical climate. So this would be the look of elegance and hierarchy. And even when you go to Jamaica in some parts of today, I think I had an experience where I was driving around with the taxi driver, and he was pointing out houses to me about which house is a good house, which house is a bad house, which house is an okay house. And all the houses that had pure, Eurocentric European features were the houses of optimal prime excellence. And that's where individuals really wanted to live psychologically. So we see that there's a reappropriation then and now, where reappropriation then post-slavery was architectural assimilation, all while dealing with discrimination, segregation, and a perceived sense of inferiority. Individuals, once they're gaining freedom and seeking to gain equality, they're really looking to assimilate into culture, not just architecturally, but even with clothing, with the style of speech, the way that individuals dress, and the way that individuals carry themselves. Whereas reappropriation now is a bit different. So modern day, there's an architectural adaptation where, because of the rise of culture, and I think because of hip hop and just more of the urban identity and that sense of having a place in the world, people started to use spaces differently. From that image I showed earlier with, essentially hip hop beginning in a New York City housing authority park that was made for playing tennis or basketball. So this brought us back full circle to our research and discovery about what is a Pan-African architectural structure. And we drew 4 common comparisons between then and now that could be placed into architectural patterns to actually build and design a building. And that would be context, transformation, adaptation, and culture, which would be the reappropriation of Black culture in foreign lands. So summarizing all of this, we could see that there's a context in transformation. There's the movement of a people and its culture, where individuals were forced from living in their homes in West Africa to becoming slaves in America. And they were building with the same vernacular architectural style that they would relative to West Africa or back home, wherever they came from. And moving into the 19th century, we see that transformation came into a sense of assimilation, where there was a forced adaptation, where slave quarters in the South really is the ethos and the birth of the Black South culture, because of slave owners and plantation owners. They wanted to make sure that individuals who are being born into slavery, or individuals who were here into slavery, had essentially had a conceptual birth in the idea of slavery from living in these particular quarters. So this actually became like the culture of the Deep South. And this, even after slavery, individuals, even when they changed the way that they built, it stemmed from this level of colonialism and slave housing in the plantation in the South. But if we look towards a transformation in more recent years, it's not necessarily assimilation, it's more so resistance. And I think that Christian spoke about this in his speech, and I believe that Motley will speak about this in her speech as well, where there's a forced adaptation, but there's a sense of pride and place and identity and belonging. And this is where the resistance comes in, where I think the images on the bottom left and also on the right is very pivotal, because as you see the municipal building, that's just not the use for it. I mean, anyone of American of idealism would look at this and say that this is defiling property, but this is just individuals culturally expressing themselves. And who's to say that the image on the right can't be an image of art, or the and I want to make sure that I pronounce this correctly, the Ndebele culture in South Africa. So I think that there's many different comparisons that we can draw between African American cultural expression and African expression on the entire continent. So what we see is that in more recent years, there's a new culture that really has been birthed from, and I want to keep the context very, very focused on hip hop and just urban culture, that individuals started to walk a certain way. They started to express themselves a certain way. There's clothing that panders, that really like embodies what it means to become or to come from these particular areas. So there's a sense of culture, there's a sense of identity, cultural expression. And as we all know, hip hop is something that started from, mixing jazz records and mixing the loops and taking them and making entire songs over them while an MC would rap over them. Whereas now we're essentially making our own music. There are subcultures underneath hip hop music from a musical perspective. However, we see that there's still not really African American architecture, right? We've been able to really find our wings in all these different areas, in clothing, in fashion, in music. But as far as architecture, we're still inhabiting spaces. People are still in New York City Housing Authority buildings. And essentially, it's, as we saw before, this is the architecture of the resistance. So much of the music stems back to that particular period. So this brings me to just the entire research and discovery of the village and the community, which will be the built environment of Black wellness. And I think that in a previous, in Christian's presentation, and I think he spoke on the idea of just the porch as being a magnate in just the Black community. And I think that when you look at these two images, you see two very different areas at two very different times, but there's a sense of thriving in community. So we see that individuals of color, when you think of Black wellness and Black happiness, they really tend to really see themselves in a position of success when they're around others who look like them. And if we look at a traditional Zulu homestead, we see that carries over, that there's a positioning of thriving in the community where individuals in the tribe, they essentially win when they're together. So furthering this research and discovery, we got into the aesthetics of Pan-African wellness. And I think that cultural expression, and I want to bring up this image on the right again next to this image on the left, I think that it's very important to understand that for any culture, I don't even think just African American culture, for any culture, cultural expression is extremely important, where the image on the right is that this is forthright. This is what they wanted to do. Whereas the image on the right, this is an individual who essentially is making a building what he deems fit. And this is obviously during an era where graffiti wasn't necessarily looked at as art. And looking at more Pan-African aesthetics, we can see that there's a liking to natural undisturbed texture tied to local culture. So as you see the image on the right, we have Jamaican huts essentially with, we see Jamaican huts essentially with the cladding of paint where we have the Rastafarian colors and Jamaican colors. And I think that ties back into the idea of cultural expression. And furthering our research and discovery and bringing this entire thing to a close, there was a reappropriation of space taking shape, and what this would be like in form. So what we did is we took all of this knowledge that we were able to accrue in a very short amount of time. Obviously, this has been a span of 5 years, and we're able to essentially obviously work with the pragmatic ideology of building this particular building, and designing it so that it would be built in a manner where it could still fit the context of New York City, the infrastructure that obviously was built for the betterment of a certain kind of people and the disadvantage of others. And I think that what we created was essentially a building that we felt really inspired and resonated with African Americans in a Harlem context, focal to the Hamilton Heights section. So in closing, I mean, I just want to say that, this particular building is actually right now in construction, and it's been an amazing and massive undertaking. I could delve very deeply into the building. And what I will say is that we just wanted to create something that really lent itself to the culture of individuals who were living in America. And this is a form that is essentially up for debate on how the children will feel, but I think that it's a very good feeling to actually be able to get community input and see how the individuals who will actually be inhabiting the space feel about this particular space. So as I was about to previously say, is that I could speak for 3 hours about how this building came together, but this is, I think that the fact that we were able to, design this particular structure and see it through currently right now in construction, and see that the community has embraced it thus far has been an amazing feeling, just as a young architectural designer. And that is essentially our take on the reappropriation of space taking shape. So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak here today.